Hi, it's Frank from Mann Lake, and today we're going to talk about the importance of feeding your bees, when you need to feed them, and the different things we have to feed them. So we're going to take a look at one of these hives. So we're going to assess this hive and decide what feed we're going to do and how we're going to feed them. So what I want to see when I go into a hive is that I want to see that they've got some open wet nectar around the brood nest, and I also want to see that they've got some pollen in there as well, because we want our bees to constantly be raising brood. Our bees can't raise brood unless they've got incoming nectar, which is sucrose, liquid sucrose, and we need them to bring in pollen. If they're not bringing in both of those, brood rearing shuts down. So I'm going to just take a look at this frame, and I'm going to ensure that we don't have our queen on here, which we don't. They've got a nice store of honey on there, but we were assessing feed today. So I'm going to work toward the center of the brood nest and see what we've got. So I've got a frame here with brood on it, cap brood. I see some open brood around it, but as you can see, this open band where brood has emerged, there's no wet nectar in there and there's no pollen in there. So I'm going to say that we need to feed these bees because we are in a either pollen dearth or a nectar dearth or both. When we feed our bees, we've got multiple ways to feed them. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is when we're going to feed syrup. There's two syrups we can feed our bees. A commercial syrup which has glucose, fructose, sucrose, all three sugars in it, so our bees can continue to make wax, put weight on the hive, raise brood, and put fat bodies on themselves. We have a commercial feed, Pro Sweet. That contains all three sugars. That can let the bees do whatever they want as far as putting weight in the hive, raising brood, anything they want to do with it. Or if we want to do something in particular, we only want to raise brood, we don't care about putting weight on it, we might feed them a liquid sucrose, which is a straight sugar. Table sugar, white sugar, and water, usually about equal weights. So as I look at this hive, I'm going to say, how am I going to feed this? It depends on the temperature. If it is cold out, we want to get that feed as close to that brood nest as we can. So we want to use something like a frame feeder. Now this happens to be a 1 gallon frame feeder. It's very convenient because it takes the place of one frame. We'd push it all the way down in here. We would fill it with syrup, whatever syrup we chose to feed, and the bees could feed out of there. The good part about this is, if it's chilly and the bees are starting to go into cluster, it doesn't matter. They can still get to this feed. The problem a lot of beekeepers have is they use the wrong feeder for the wrong time of year. Another feeder is, we all know the Boardman feeder. It's a great feeder. But if it's cold outside and your bees are going into cluster and you put this in the entrance where it goes, the bees are never going to get to that feeder down there because they're up in cluster and they can starve. This is really important, especially for people putting in a new package or a nuke that's not really strong at the moment. You put that feed down low when they're in cluster, they're going to starve to death even though they've got syrup there. So great feeder when the temperature's warmer and the bees are flying, but not a great feeder when it's cold. The colder it is, the more we want to use this frame feeder. The last feeder we have is what we call a top feeder. This feeder holds approximately 2 gallons of syrup. We're going to put it right on top of this colony, and we're going to fill both sides with one or both sides with some sort of sugar syrup, whether it be the commercial blend or straight sucrose. The bees are going to come up through the bottom of here. They're going to come up through the top, walk their way down, and they're going to take that syrup in. And one thing I will tell you about syrups, a commercial blend has a high solid content, so it's not going to ferment and it's not going to crystallize. When you feed a straight sucrose and the temperature's warm, the natural yeast in there are going to cause that syrup to ferment. So if your bees don't take it quickly, you want to put something in it like Pro Health. Pro Health is essential oils, and what that does is they have antifungal, antimicrobial properties. It will stop that sucrose syrup from fermenting, and it also causes the bees to actually feed a little more on it. So it's a feed stimulant as well. You can use it in the commercial syrup as well as that feed stimulant. You don't need to put it in there to stop fermentation though. But this is something I typically use whenever I'm feeding. So those are our syrup feeds. Now I'm going to talk about the solid feeds, the pollen substitute. When there's no pollen coming in to our colony, we need to give them a pollen substitute. Bees will never take a pollen substitute if there's real pollen, but when there's no pollen, they will. We've got two methods of feeding. We've got a dry pollen, which is what's in the pollen feeder there on the ground. It's a powder. We put it out somewhere around the bee yard in a container, protect it from the rain. The bees will come, they'll gather that, put it in their pollen baskets and bring it back to the colony. Or we can put a pollen patty on. Now, if I've got two deeps in my brood nest, I'll typically put this patty between the two boxes. In the springtime, when we're first, the bees are starting to raise brood for the first time, the bees will all be in the top box anyway. I am gonna put it up here like this. So that's where I'm gonna do my feeding on that. It's very important as a beekeeper to understand how feed works with honeybees. Sucrose, whether it be in a commercial mixture or sugar and water, that is a compound sugar, sucrose. The bees use sucrose to do two things: stimulate the queen to lay eggs and stimulate the wax glands to make wax. The pollen is a protein. The bees use the protein, they bring it in like pollen, they mix it with some of that sucrose to make bee bread. You have to understand the connection between sucrose and pollen to understand how the bees raise brood. The bees will take some pollen in, they'll take some sucrose in, they'll mix it together, they'll make bee bread. The nurse bees feed on the bee bread, make royal jelly, feed the royal jelly to every bee in that hive for the first 3 days of its life, and then you get brood rearing. You take away pollen or you take away sucrose and you have no brood rearing. We know in this time with the problems we're having with viruses and mites, it's important to keep our bees rearing brood through the entire season when we can. So when you go into a nectar dearth, you need to feed. So just understand the best way to feed your bees when you're feeding, temperature, weather conditions, what feeder you want to use, and what type of pollen sub you want to use. And you'll come out of it with a healthier, bigger colony.